Welcome to the Brown Bag Podcast. We have a really special episode today. Dr. Gina Garcia is here to talk to us. So it's kind of like a bonus episode. And we just have a few questions for her. Sandra and I got to attend her talk today to the Chabot community. So we wanted to be able to bring her ideas to the whole campus, to those of you that weren't able to make it. So Sandra's going to kick us off with some questions.
So as an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institute, being recognized by the federal government since 1992, why do you think your book, the research that you're providing, is such a hot topic right now?
Oh, that's a good question. First, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here and to speak with y'all and to visit Chabot College in general. It's been very warm and welcoming. Yeah, that's a great question about why is HSI a hot topic? Well, I think one of the key bigger demographic drivers is that the Latino, Latinx, Latina population is growing and it's not going down. And that's huge at a population level in the U.S. We're going to see at some point the Latina population is going to surpass, right, most other groups, including white folks, right, of European descent, right, if we go back that far. And so, or at least get to parity, right, in our lifetimes, that the population is young. It's a young population and a growing population, right? Even if we eliminated immigration, as some presidents have wanted, we're here and we're reproducing. Yeah. So we're not going to go away, right? So your K through 12 schools, you see predominantly Latinx school systems, and then they're going to college. Mm-hmm. So college is it's just that it has now hit college, right? So that's why I think the conversation is so hot, we'll say, because the population is a population that's going to continue to grow in the U.S. Yeah. From a college perspective, why is that important? From I'll use a neoliberal perspective, why presidents and leaders and decision makers care is because that's tuition dollars, that's enrollment, right? So you know, leaders who are making decisions need to care about who is the population that we're going to see entering our colleges and enrolling in our colleges, right? Whereas those of us that are serving, that will then greet them, right, and greet our students, that's where the servingness conversation comes in. Is like, well, now that they're here, we know they're here, how are we going to serve our Latinx population? How are we going to do this differently? Because we've never been intentional about this. The most intentional organizational construct that's similar is the HBCU construct, and those were long-term. They're historical and have been serving African American, Black, formerly, descendants of formerly enslaved people forever, right? For a long time, over a century already. So that's a different construct altogether than colleges and universities trying to figure out how we're going to now serve Latinx students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. HBCUs are like such a great model for that in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot that we can learn from. One thing that I know you probably encounter in doing this work, and you mentioned it in your talk, is just the whataboutism. What about me and what about my group? And if we're doing HSI, does that mean that we're not serving these other groups? And I would just love to hear you talk about, how do we, build bridges with folks around this stuff? We've talked a little bit on campus about the concept target universalism, that like when you focus on one group, it's going to have great outcomes for everybody. But I think people get a little anxious and they get worried and scared that they're going to be left out or there's such limited resources. So how do you address folks that say that and help them, kind of engage in this work?
Yeah, it's a tough conversation. So the reality is, at a bigger, larger societal perspective, that is a product of white supremacy culture, right? That we are starting to fight amongst groups, right? Communities of color fighting for resources is a product of white supremacy culture, right? That's we think that there's only so much, right? It's also a product of capitalism, right? I'll bring in all the isms because capitalism creates an idea of scarcity, a scarcity mindset that we think we have to work really hard to get whatever it is we're going to get. And the United States is basically known for that, right? Like people come here the American dream is built on an idea of meritocracy, that if I work really hard, I will get, right? And so capitalism is at the core of all that. And so people fight and think that there's only resources for a few people because that's how the U.S. society is, right? And so I would say it creeps its head in amongst us. And so then we start doing it. We're starting to like fight amongst ourselves, right? Of like, is there enough for everybody? And so I think we have to, the way to disrupt systems of oppression is to acknowledge them, right? So just saying it is like, yeah, that's why we are fighting amongst ourselves, right? Or feeling like that there's only so many pieces of the pie, whereas we could bake more pies, right? Like we really could, right? Like that's what we're here. That's what we're doing, is trying to figure out how we're going to utilize our resources to better serve more folks, right?
Or cut the pie a different way.
Cut it a different way, it's fine. And not everybody wants pie, right? There's an equity question.
Needs pie.
Needs pie, yeah. And so there's the equity question, right? Is like some people don't need the pie at all, and are okay with passing on it. And so I use the equity conversation, right, rather than the universalism, because I think equity is a way that we have, well, if we do equity right, we actually are supposed to serve more intentionally the groups that are facing inequities. Right? So, when we say Black Lives Matter, yes, everybody's lives matter, but Black folks are being killed at higher rates by police. That's where the movement comes from, right? Among many other things. So yeah, if there's an equity issue here when a certain group of people are being killed more often or being incarcerated more often, and that's Black folks, then yeah, we need to focus on the system that is recreating that, right? Why is that happening? Why do we create that? And we could do that with different groups, right? Each group is facing different inequities, right? There's a variety of inequities that if we start looking at all the groups that have needs, because a lot of groups have needs, are inequities, right? So how do we start to look at it in that sort of way, right? It's like, yeah, we could then some folks, back to the pie analogy, some folks do need more pie, while others don't need very much at all. And yet we still can use the same resources. And I think the needs is important, but also the want, right? Because some students are going to be like, I don't need that, and therefore I don't want it, just for wanting for sakes, because I just don't, right? Like, and I'm okay, and thank you all, but I'm good. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we need to grapple with. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to it and how to address it. Besides, as an equity scholar and a social justice educator, I say, we have to talk about it, right? That the first thing we got to do is talk about it. We can't disrupt something that we don't fully understand. So if we fully understand it, then we can start to think about it, how we can look at it differently.
And that also comes to mind to me is like knowing our community, knowing who our community is, and knowing what their needs and wants are. Right? We were just having lunch with our institutional research professionals and collaborating with Carmen to say, okay, what are ways that we can go ahead and open up the conversation and do quantitative measurable outcomes that are going to be liberatory, and we can really gather the data so that we can institutionalize it, right? And I just had to stop and say thank you to them. Thank you for being open. Thank you for being present. Thank you for listening, because many of my Puente colleagues at other campuses don't have that, right? And they're reaching out to me saying, well, how did you get this? Or how did you do that? And it's like, oh, well, my IR people or my admin or my dean. And they're like, oh, they're the ones that are stopping us. So like, what other ways are there that we can go ahead and move forward with our work, And so, knowing our community, I think, that informs us what kind of pie we need.
And whether or not we're going to be able to actually bake the pie, right? Because what you're talking about is folks stopping initiatives or not supporting them. That's a larger organizational, structural sort of issue, right? That like now we can't even do the work. If once we all agree, like, okay, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to move forward, this is how we're going to serve multiple folks, and then structurally it doesn't happen, right? We've tried that before. It didn't work before. We're not going to do that. We don't have funds. We don't. All the reasons why we can't do things. So yeah, I think there's that too, right?
Yeah. And I think my next question is just, I feel like there's a lot of folks that feel like they are doing the work, right? And I've been thinking a lot. They self-identify, right? And I've been thinking a lot about just like being born at a certain time and kind of the messages that we got around education. And a lot of what we got was like multiculturalism, right? Like, yeah, celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month or Asian Month. And I found this great Black author. I'm going to bring in her. It's Black History Month. I did a whole thing on science, the scientists, and they're like, yes, I'm doing equity. I'm doing it, right? And I think there was a time when that was validated, right, and celebrated, those little kind of those little steps really felt big. But now we're like asking for more from people, right, to really push back against this white supremacist system. So I was just curious to hear from you, just like, well, what do you think are, like, if you want to just talk a little bit about some of the practices and policies that go beyond just diversifying your
yeah, for sure. Yes, thank you for bringing the multiculturalism conversation, because that, I think about the evolution of where we're at now, right? And multiculturalism was where we kind of started, right? And that comes out of like the movements in like the 1960s, right? Like civil rights movements. And then we get to like, let's celebrate, right?
Yeah.
Then we got to the point where we realized celebrating wasn't enough, right? And then we moved into diversity, we moved into inclusion, we moved into equity, right? We go through these different stages. I don't know where we're at right now because people are pushing back on all those things.
I know.
Right? And then we got to like belonging, right? I was like, now we're going to just belong? That's kind of not any of those things, right? I'm like, and so to me, the watering down of it, right, is harmful. But the multiculturalism, I think, is interesting because you need that. Like, if I think about the people that are doing the work and the people that think they're doing the work versus those that are actually doing the work, the multiculturalism piece is a piece. Like, if there's different things you need to understand a different population. If you're going to serve them, that's like basic, right? But that's what it is. It's basic. Right? Yeah, it's super basic. You can't stop so there. So it's like, that's like 101 and maybe not even 101, right? It's like pre before you get into the 101, right? Yeah, understanding other folks and their ways of being and knowing and whatnot is a part of this work, because the reality of like the social justice work where you're actually talking about disrupting systems of oppression is like, you have to be able to understand, but you also have to be able to understand the much deeper 200 level, 300 level work is structurally, why is this happening to this group, right? Like I give the example of how the Black Lives Matter movement comes about and the numbers, disproportionate number of African American Black folks being murdered by police. And then we say, but why, right? Structurally, okay? So once we get those data, we're like, okay, but why, right? Then you got to understand how racism works, because it isn't individuals against individuals, because it's actually, when we talk about police, the race, it don't matter the race of the police officer. It's actually the larger system. It's the carceral system. Institution. The carceral system is the one that's problematic, right? It's bigger than the people. That any person that gets into it then also is a part of it, right? And so you have to understand the bigger structural level, right? So it's like, it's layered. So understanding folks, their diversity and their needs and their foods and their cultures and their music, that's the fun part. And that's, yes, we should do that too. But then we need to get into deeper, what are the inequities? Why are the inequities happening? And how are we going to disrupt them?
Yeah, and I think it sounds, I mean, like you said, like that stuff is fun and this stuff is hard. And it's so hard for people to make that leap. It's just because I think it does require a lot of almost like personal development, right? Like you have to be willing to look at yourself. You have to be thinking about your positionality. You have to think about even your role in this oppressive structure. And I think people are scared,
Yeah. It's the fear that keeps them from moving to that next level.
Yeah, it is. It's scary.
What's it going to say about me? What am I going to uncover? Like, can I really address their needs? Like, if I'm opening up to my students, can I answer their questions? Then if I'm not there yet, if I'm not open to
it's way easier to just say, but I ate the pupusas and they were amazing. And it was so good. And we listened to Spanish music. And it was so good. Versus like, what you said was fascinating about like, scary even about my own self, right? Like, do I have there's internalized oppression too, right? Then what kind of biases and things do I hold about other people, right?
Yeah.
And that's the reality is we all have that,
Yeah.
right? Dominant groups, people with privilege tend to hold it more, but even as minoritized folks, we hold it too, right? In different ways, and sometimes it is internalized, and we begin to believe it.
Yeah.
Whatever
The
society,
stereotype.
whatever the U.S. culture has told us, right, which is a reflection of white supremacy culture, that we start to believe it, right? We believe it about other people, we believe it about our own groups, and it's all at this systemic level, and it's scary, absolutely scary to address the systemic level.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how do you do it? I mean, how do you, because it is, I think particularly now, it is kind of a discouraging time, I mean, on one end, it's exciting in California because we are really doing a lot of cool things. We're having this whole DEIACT stuff coming through the state, right? And like we have ethnic studies in all of our schools now. Like it's very exciting. But then in the nation, it's not, right? There's a lot of pushback. And so I'm just curious as like, how do you take care of yourself to keep doing this work, especially when it's so discouraging?
I think that we all have to acknowledge that this is hard work and take breaks as needed, right?
Yeah.
The reality is this is a really hard time to do this kind of work. It is hard to do justice work right now because politically we see at a national level that the former president gets indicted, their mugshot comes out, and there's rooms, I don't know if y'all have seen the social media post, right? Rooms full of people cheering, right? Like, for him, not against him, not like, yay, he got indicted or this is Mike, but they're actually cheering for him. And the whole Republican Party saying they would actually support him if he got the nomination, right? During national debate, right? Like, well, we would. We signed that little pledge that we would. Like, and there were over 70 million people that voted for a person who is dividing us and spewing hate and reinforcing a lot of this. And so nationally, we're just in a really wild time. That we made so much progress, and now we're going backwards. And people's basic rights are being, overturned. Affirmative action gets overturned, which at this point it was like, how is that even possible? How does something that's been in place for over 40 years get overturned? Like
they had enough. They're like, we got enough for y'all in these positions.
I know. And the court, like the whole idea of stacking the courts was actually real. We've watched all of this, right? To like really put in those positions that can take away our basic human rights, right? To take away Roe v. Wade, again, something that like, how did this get dismantled? And how did the rest of us allow it to, and not even that, like that they have the ability to, right? Like you were the appointed person that we apparently appointed the person that appointed you, even though some of us didn't, right? And now our basic human rights that were in place for decades are being dismantled. So it's hard to do this work right now. It really is. I think we have to remain diligent. We have to remain hopeful. I always say I am an eternal optimist, and I am, right? I continue to be like, I have the rosy glasses on, right? I'm like, I continue to be like, yes, I see a brighter future. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We can do this. And I think we have to sort of, be optimistic in that way. But the reality is justice work is, it's hard, and we do need to take breaks. We get tired, those of us that do this work. We get tired and we need breaks. And those of us that are surrounded by folks, we need to give folks breaks when they're tired. Because if we lose soldiers in the movement, then we lose people, right? We lose people in the movement. So we got to take care of each other. We got to care for each other. And support each other through this work, and support our own wellness, because it's hard. It's hard to think that you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I think many of us do that through this kind of work. So,
Cool. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you, and we appreciate the work that you're doing. It is making an impact. We were talking about how do we move the needle. It's not just El Puente. It's not just, but, how can we move the needle? And so I think you've given us a good foundation and a point of conversation to get started on this campus. And it's interesting that it was like the president and our chancellor said, it's a point of it's the beginning of a conversation. We've been having this conversation, right? But I'm glad that they're involved in the conversation now. They're partaking in the conversation now. And so it may be a beginning for them, and we're welcoming them into the conversation. So thank you very much for allowing that space and that opportunity for us to have that conversation with them.
Thank you. Thank you all for having it. And yeah, stay strong in la lucha.
Yes.
Some folks spoke on their book, right? It's like, we got to stay strong and fight for real. Otherwise, like, what are we gonna do? You know, like we gotta stay united, and yeah. So y'all keep doing the work. Y'all doing good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.